This is chapter 3, our first brief lecture, and this brief lecture is going to concentrate on defining what ethics is and the different perspective on ethics that can be utilized to determine whether a behavior is ethical or not. Now, I know most of you have heard this term before, especially those of you that are business majors. Ethics is a major concern for corporations, and it has to do with the larger understanding of the role of the firm in the external environment and in society. Of course, we do believe, and we still believe, that firms need to maximize the wealth of shareholders, but we are very concerned about how businesses treat society, how they behave as they pursue this maximization of shareholder wealth. So therefore, this consideration of ethics is a very contemporary consideration and a very relevant consideration. We want businesses to not only be successful and profitable, but to contribute to the well-being of society. And one way that they can do that is by being ethical in their actions. So first of all, what is ethics? Well, we see there that ethics is described as a moral code of principles. Well, that's really important because of that word moral. What does that mean? Moral code of principles. Well, it means that we determine actions based upon whether they are good or bad. I should say we describe actions based upon whether they are seen as good or bad or right or wrong. Now, that seems pretty self-explanatory, okay? Ethics is about good or bad, right or wrong. Well, here's my question to you. Who determines what good is and what bad is, or what right is or what wrong is? Well, you can say the individual determines. I determine what if something is good or something is bad or right or wrong. Well, that's not necessarily true. Some of your values does help in determining that. But ethical behavior is largely determined by the governing moral code. And that governing moral code normally comes from the society in which we or the organization exist in. So ethical behavior, ethics, that code of conduct, is largely determined by social norms, by laws, by practices, by institutions in the society. And I want you to start thinking about that. If ethics is largely determined by society, then may ethical conduct or ethical codes differ across society. That's something that we're going to look at a little bit later, but just start thinking about that. It says ethical behavior has some kind of relationship to laws and values. I just said that society determines and influences in some way that moral code of conduct that we ascribe to. But be careful. Legal behavior is not necessarily ethical behavior. In the 1900s in South Africa, it was perfectly legal to practice apartheid. Apartheid was a political system that hindered or limited the ability of black South Africans to rise or be mobile in society. They were segregated upon. The same thing obviously occurred in the United States. Well, those actions were perfectly legal. But many people within South Africa and obviously within the world question whether they were ethical, whether they were good or whether they were right. So there's not necessarily a one-to-one or direct correlation, I should say 100% correlation between what is legal and what is ethical. While laws do, of course, influence and play a part in determining our society, so we believe it is wrong to kill, right? And it is also illegal to kill. They aren't necessarily the be-all, end-all in terms of determining ethics. And then also personal values help to determine our ethical behavior. We might personally ascribe to certain types of values that frame what we see as being ethical or unethical. For example, you might believe personally that you shouldn't download music. You shouldn't download music even if it might be technically legally okay, your personal values might suggest that this is not something that you want to do, something is something that you see as being wrong, and therefore your morality is framed by that values. But just like legal institutions, personal values are just one component of determining what ethical behavior is, what that ethical code is. So that's important to see the relationship, if you will, between the law, the legal framework, and also the personal value framework as it relates to ethics and ethical conduct. And values are simply, your underlying beliefs and your attitudes and they help determine your individual behavior. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but you saw the example that I just used in terms of your value with respect to not downloading music. These are 4 perspectives on ethical behavior, and essentially because ethics is based upon social norms, it's based upon values, it's based upon laws, and those things tend to be variant across societies and of course across individuals. You tend to get different perspectives on ethical behavior, different philosophies, different approaches to determining what is good or bad. Now, each one of these perspectives, they have advantages to them and they have disadvantages to them. And we're going to discuss them. But what I want you to clearly understand here is that none of these by themselves are correct or incorrect. They are simply different perspectives to determining whether something or whether behavior is ethical or unethical. They are simply different perspectives. We have 4 perspectives. We have the individualism view, we have the utilitarian view, we have the moral rights view, and we have the justice view. And we're going to look at each one of those individually. The first one we're going to look at is actually the utilitarian view. It's a little bit difficult to say, but you'll get it, the utilitarian view. And the question that is asked in the utilitarian view is, does a decision or behavior do the greatest good for the most people? Does a decision or behavior do the greatest good for the most people? When we consider utilitarian perspective, therefore, we are looking at it from the perspective of the majority. Now, one can argue this is a good principle to use to determine behavior based upon ethics. Okay, if you do something and it helps out the majority of the society, then it's probably a good thing to do. And so you look at it from that perspective to determine the ethic. Well, a problem, however, associated with this perspective is that what? Well, it does not necessarily account for the minority. You do take in the majority's perspective or the majority's need, and that's good, but what about the needs of the minority? They may not be met, and they might actually be infringed upon in pursuit of delivering the greatest good to the most people. So that's one disadvantage, if you will, to the utilitarian perspective. Another disadvantage to utilitarian perspective is that it is trying to predict something that is going to occur in the future without really knowing if that is going to occur. So I give you an example. Okay, a country might decide to kill a small part of its population if that population is or is carrying a certain disease, in the belief that if those people are allowed to live, they will actually infect the entire population and kill the entire population. Well, this sounds like an ethical decision. I'm trying to protect the majority of people, those without the disease, by taking the lives of the few that have the disease. From a utilitarian perspective, this seems as being ethical. Well, the problem here is, again, one, what about the minorities? What about their right to life, even if they do have an infection? And two, I don't necessarily know that these people, if allowed to live, are going to infect the rest of the population. So I'm trying again to predict something in the future that I don't necessarily have the information to do all the time. And so that's some of the drawbacks to utilitarian. But from a majority perspective, it sounds pretty reasonable. I'm doing the best for society. I'm trying to do the best for the most, and therefore my decision is right or is righteous. Okay, so that's the utilitarian perspective. The second perspective, ethical perspective, that we're going to look at is the individualism perspective. And in individualism perspective, it says here it advances the long-term self-interest of the individual. So by acting in a way that advances the long-term self-interest of individuals, you are actually acting ethically. Well, this does not sound at all to be an ethical perspective, because when I started this lecture, I said ethics really had to do with the influence of society, businesses acting in the best interests of society. Here we're talking about an individual perspective. I'm acting in my best interest. How is that even ethical? Well, this is what we call the Kantian philosophy. It comes from this person called Immanuel Kant, which was a great philosopher. And Kant's argument is this, is that if people serve their long-term self-interest, by doing that, they will actually involuntarily contribute to the well-being of society. Well, you might start to question that immediately. Well, you say, well, it is in my self-interest to steal from you. It's in my self-interest to cheat on an examination. It is my self-interest to lie about a certain transactions. Well, yeah, all those things might be true. They might be in your best self-interest and they might be instrumental. But all of those things have one thing in common. All of those events, I should say. They are all concerned with the short-term benefit. So yeah, if you cheat on this exam, you're likely to get a good grade. And if you lie about this business transaction, you're likely to get the contract. But would you like to live in a world where people continuously lie to you? Because that's what probably is going to happen if you keep cheating or you keep lying. You will indicate to others that it is okay for them to lie to you or to cheat against you. And you don't want to create a society like that, because that's not going to be in your long-term self-interest. So essentially, the philosophy of do unto others as you would have them do unto you is applied here. Not necessarily because you want to do good by others, but because you don't want others to do bad by you. And so in order to protect your long-term self-interest, you actually censor your behavior. You restrict your behavior to things that you would like to see others do to you. So you don't do bad stuff in the short term because you want to protect society and most importantly yourself in the long term. So that's kind of how the individualism perspective is related to society. You're acting for your own self-interest, but by doing so, society benefits. We all don't lie, we all don't cheat, we all don't do bad things because we want to protect our interests. And by doing so, all of us in society kind of act ethically. So I hope you understand from that perspective. But one of the drawbacks with the individualism perspective is that we assume people are going to consider this long-term interest when they act. The truth is, many of us don't. Many people in society don't consider the long-term implications of their action, and they do cheat and steal and do unethical things because they are concerned more with the short term. So that's one of the drawbacks of the individualism perspective. The third perspective that we want to concentrate on is the moral rights perspective. And this one, it maintains the fundamental rights of all human beings. Okay, one of those fundamental rights we mostly argue about is the right to life. Okay, we all have this innate right to life because we are human beings. And so from the moral rights perspective, it's all about protecting the rights of the individual, making sure that the individual rights are protected. And so therefore, when we act, we must always consider individually how moral rights are being impinged upon or being promoted. Okay, so that's the way that we look at it. We act ethically to protect someone's rights. So maybe capital punishment is seen as being unethical because we're taking a life. Yes, legally, but we're still taking someone's life. Abortion, for example. All of those things we talk about moral rights. Freedom, being able to, someone's right to fairness in trial. All of those things are seen as moral rights. Well, that again sounds reasonable. Sounds reasonable to protect these innate moral rights. But one of the issues or one of the disadvantages or one of the concerns of the moral rights perspective is that it might actually protect individual rights while sacrificing social rights or social responsibilities or social justice. What do I mean by that? Well, what if I believed that you had a moral right to to voice your opinion or to protest, okay? And so you go out there and you start voicing your opinion and you start protesting and you start stirring up people's anger, let's say against the government. And this then creates some kind of violent outburst where then it puts society in a state of chaos. Well, by allowing you to have your moral rights to protest and all those things, it actually may have or have implications, bad implications for most of society. And so by looking at you and by allowing you to do what you do, that individual moral right, that can sometimes be in direct conflict with the social right for harmony, for peace. So we have to be careful that we find that balance. And then the fourth perspective is this justice view. And the justice view is all about fairness and impartiality. It's all about looking at equality, making sure people are not being taken advantage of, and that the way that we apply rules, the way that we apply policies, the way that we allocate resources with respect to distributive justice, the way that we treat people even in terms of dignity and respect, and the way that we transact business in terms of commutative justice, that it all be done in an environment, in a context of fairness. Well, again, that sounds absolutely reasonable. If you say that to somebody, okay, I am determining ethics based upon fairness, they will say, well, that sounds pretty good. Problem with the justice view is that we don't necessarily know which one of these types of justices we might apply. Okay, is it more important to be procedurally just or distributively just or interactionally just? Okay, so there is some concern about which type of justice should be applied. But again, reasonable, but some drawbacks. So that's important for you to see that each one of these different perspectives, let me just return to those. Each one of those perspectives has a central core question. Individualism, does it promote the good of, the utilitarian, does it promote the greatest good for the most people? From the individualism, does a decision promote one's long-term self-interest? From the moral rights, does a decision maintain the fundamental rights of all human beings? And the justice, does the decision show fairness and impartiality? They all have some central theme or question. They all have advantages and they all have disadvantages. So I want you to take that into consideration when you look at these four perspectives. Now, going back or returning to what we initially talked about, the variation in ethical code based on society, you can see the manifestation of this variation in these four perspectives. And depending on which one of these four perspectives you apply, you may come up with absolutely different different perspectives or opinions on whether something is ethical or not. Depending on what you apply, you might have a different outlook on a situation in terms of determining whether or not it is ethical. That's why we often hear about these things called ethical dilemmas. Ethical dilemmas are these situations where people are trying to determine whether behavior is ethical or unethical, and it's just not simply clear cut. It happens often in life, and it happens in business. And many times organizations are faced with these types of ethical dilemmas. Your book has a number of these ethical dilemmas for you to perhaps consider, and then you will have opportunities throughout. As you read, you will be presented with ethical dilemmas. I give you a quick example right now. uh, a gentleman has just lost his job. He's lost his job because someone in his organization, much higher up than him, was committing fraud. And because they committed fraud, his business, the business that he worked for, went bankrupt and he lost his job. No fault of his own. He now cannot find any employment because everyone that he goes to apply for a job to thinks that he was in fact involved with the fraud. And so he has no opportunity whatsoever to find any type of employment. He cannot qualify for any type of government aid. And so he has two children, one on the way. They're all hungry. His wife's hungry. And so what does he do? He goes out to a supermarket and he steals some food and some baby formula. Well, is it ethical? The easy answer is, of course it isn't. It is wrong to steal, no matter what. Well, what about his dying babies? Do they not have a right? Do they not have a right to life? Should they not be protected? And if they're not being protected by the law, then shouldn't he take that into consideration? Again, it is not that simple, it seems. It's more complex because we have to look at the situation, we have to look at the force, we also have to look at the society. In some societies, the subordination of women in terms of what types of jobs they can hold, what they wear, is perfectly acceptable and it's seen as ethical. In other countries of the world, that type of behavior, those types of policies would actually be seen as being unethical because they would perhaps be infringing upon freedom and equality and fairness and a justice perspective. So it is not that clear cut. And if I'm not going to go into a ton of philosophical debates and give you a whole lot of examples. As I said, these are prevalent in your text in other arenas. So I would highly suggest to you that you spend some time perhaps looking at some of these and looking at it from the four perspectives that we discussed. Before I end this lecture, I want to also look at another dimension to this variation of ethics in terms of the cultural issues. As we said before, society has a major impact, and because culture, which is the general or collective value system, if you will, of societies and norms and values that exist in society, that must, of course, have a huge impact. There are two general, very interesting perspectives on the relationship of culture to ethics. The first one is the cultural relativism approach, which says that ethical behavior is always determined by cultural context. Essentially, this is the mantra, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So, I will determine whether something is good or bad, or I should say, I cannot determine whether an action is good or bad unless I know the context or the situation in which it is being done in. So I can only determine ethics if I understand the context. That's cultural relativism. So if I go to South America and I pay a bribe in order to get my plant built, then that isn't really unethical because in South America it's pretty normal and acceptable to pay bribes. So although in the United States it might be seen as morally corrupt, in South America, not so much. So the cultural relativism argument is that ethics is based upon the culture, right? The moral absolutism, which is only the other end of the spectrum, if you will, says behavior unacceptable in one's home environment should not be acceptable anywhere else. So if I don't do this at home, if it's against the law, if it is seen as morally wrong at home in my home country, then I should apply those values, that code, universally across my environment. Regardless of where I am, that's how I am going to act. Well, I don't know where you fall in terms of these perspectives. You might be more in the moral absolutism, more in the cultural relativism. But let's say you were a proponent of the moral absolutism, that you said, okay, listen, here are the values, here are the American values. Most of you, I'm assuming, are from the United States. This is what in the United States we see as morally good or bad. And then you apply that universally. Well, you might be seen as being an ethical imperialist. Well, what is an ethical imperialist? It is one that imposes one's ethical standards on others. What do I mean by that? Well, you are suggesting that because something is seen as good or bad in the United States, then it should be seen as good or bad everywhere else. And the argument against that is that by doing that, you assume that as a United States citizen or individual, you have some type of ethical superiority. In fact, you have, for the entire world, decided what is good or bad. So you have come and said, you know what, in my country, this is wrong, and therefore it should be wrong in your country. In my country, all women have the right to all areas of employment. And in your country, that's not so. So you are not morally correct, and you need to change in order to be morally correct. Well, again, this in some way ignores the fact that countries have different histories, they have different cultures, they have different values, they have different contexts. And so by suggesting that a moral code created in one country can equally and fairly apply to others in another country might be a little bit absurd and definitely might be seen as being somewhat imperialistic. So you have to again be conscious of these different perspectives and be conscious of the arguments. Like arguments against cultural relativism is, of course, well, if you have all these different rules in these different places, then you never really know how to act, and your behavior can be highly variable, and we can never really trust you. Because I can't say that you don't steal. Well, you might not steal in the United States, but you might steal in Russia. So that again, there's an argument. So for all of these different perspectives, the four perspectives we looked at, even for cultural relativism and absolutism, there's drawbacks and there's also arguments for, proponents for. So all I wanted to do here was introduce you to ethics, introduce you to the concept, introduce you to different perspectives, and look at this concept or this issue of relativism versus absolutism. So look out for the brief lecture number 2 in this chapter 3 that deals with corporate social responsibility. Take care.